Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. Now this video is going to kind of be a bit of a show and tell how I did it sort of video. And right from the top, this video is not aimed at the seasoned racer. They know what they're doing. I can't teach them anything. This is more about how I could possibly give some hints and tips to guys that want to go a little bit quicker, maybe don't quite know where to get the speed from. Maybe I can help there. So over the weekend I entered a race. The previous video shows the Staffs Rally and I had a little bit of success, I'm glad to say. I came second in the classic class and second in the 80s and 90s class. So in the classic class I was racing my team slot Renault A310 and for my efforts I won this very nice Ford Escort Cosworth. It's awesome. And in the 80s and 90s class I was racing my Ninco 037, which is what this video is all about. And for my efforts with that one, I won this nice Seat Ibiza body shell with the under tray. I've got big plans for this, so stay tuned. So, with the weekend's antics out the way, I'd like to bring your attention to the subject in hand, my Ninco 037. Now, this is a great car, but in standard form, I couldn't drive it. There are a great many of these in our club in standard form and they go really well. But me, I couldn't get on with mine, so I had to go through a few developments to get it to where it is now, which is a pretty competitive car given its results on the weekend. So although this isn't a comprehensive tuning guide and there are guys that can do it far better than me, I thought I'd share what I've done to mine over the course of about 4 different tuning sessions. And maybe somebody could get something out of it, maybe not, who knows, we'll find out. I'll bring you down to the bench and I'll go through each stage for you. So, to get the ball rolling, we'll start with the basics, body float. Now as you can see, we got a little bit of body float and a little bit of body rock, which is exactly what you want to get the ball rolling. So, I get this body off. We can see what we got going on under the hood, and I will take you through stage 1 of the tune. So you can see we've got shoulder bolts for a start. And there is the basic layout. There's some modifications going on there and I'll get to those as we go through the video. So let's start at the beginning, the shock towers. On my car, one of the shock towers had broken right from the word go. They're supposed to be sitting on each corner. Mine aren't there because they're a problem. So this is the problem. The shock tower looks something like this, and they have a habit of snapping right across there. Now this is the shock itself, or the spring I guess it is, not really a shock. And this round piece at the top clips in to this hole here. Of course, if this piece here is snapped, this not going anywhere. So to solve that problem on mine, right from the word go, is I cut myself a piece of brass, 0.7mm, thus. I then drilled a hole in the middle of it, which is the correct size to take the shoulder inside here using a vernier gauge. I measured that bore, drilled the hole. Then I cut across here and removed this piece so that the shock absorber can slide in and out nicely. Once I had that done, I chopped off the brass across here, discarding that. I then also chopped the original plastic tower right across there, so that when you marry these two pieces together, you actually recreate the original shock tower, but this time it's got a brass top half. Then I draw the picture again. I've ended up with something like that. If we continue it down as if it were on the plastic, and then it's mounted onto the plastic, and the plastic is kind of like that, and the brass ends up being like that. So I then got another piece of brass, and I added the other piece of brass to the back, notched it around there, and around there, brought it down. Then I continued this line up, and continued that line across, chopped off all this. So you basically remake the top of the shock absorber looking like this, but behind the shock absorber you've got a piece of extra brass which is coming down here, and obviously it goes up there as well, soldered, two pieces soldered together. That was then positioned into position. This piece was glued into place and a small brass rivet put through the base to give it some strength. That basically rebuilt my broken shock tower, and then I had a car that I could use again from a chassis that was otherwise completely useless with a broken shock tower. The next stage was to replace the motor. Now this isn't the same format as it was started off originally, so bear with me. You can fit a much larger motor into the 037 chassis than the Sparker motor. I'm told, and I didn't try it, but I was told that the Sparker motor wasn't big enough for competition use, needed something a bit more oomphy. So I got this nice little motor from Pendle Slot, and again, not in this chassis, but in the original chassis, you've got an open space at the back of the motor pod, and if you chop away the excess plastic, you can get the motor to go straight in. Now yes, you do have to build a little mount on the back and to get the motor in, and I'll draw you a little drawing of what I did to get my motor in right now. Okay, so in section we had our motor here in the chassis on the original plastic section of the Ninco chassis, with the pinion up here. The chassis was then cut out to the rearward space, and there is actually a small piece of plastic still left on the chassis there. Now obviously there's nothing to hold the back end in, so we need to create that. So the piece that I created, I'll draw it up here so you can see, came up over the top, jiggled around, and then went off that way, and then there was a hole through the middle of it. So that obviously then sat in this gap here. So it came up, folded over on itself, came down around that piece there, and out over here. Just fill in the rest of it. It's very difficult to draw in this orientation, but you get the idea. And then obviously the pip at the back of the motor, whatever you want to call it, stuck through the brass, and there you are. And I just pinned it straight through the back. So that got my motor in. And then to stop the Ninco hop, I then hot glued with hot glue down the sides, and that was the motor sorted. Then NSR tyres, of course. What else would you use? And that completed phase one of my tuning, and it was okay. It worked okay. It wasn't great. It still had a lot of issues, but it was more drivable for me personally than the original stock arrangement. Okay, on to phase two, as phase one wasn't really cutting it for me. The motor pod. So with the shock towers all fixed, or the shock tower all fixed, the second shock tower broke simply just by trying to change some tyres. Now I suspected that the shock towers were a little bit fragile, so I changed this tyre very, very carefully, because this one was already, the shock tower was already super strong. Very carefully changed the shock, the tyre, and it still broke. The other shock tower broke. So that was me done. I was fed up with these silly shock towers. So out with everything, chopped off the shock towers, and got myself a slot-it motor pod. At the time it was the 0 offset pod, just a straight up normal pod. that was all the chassis was all cut out and the pod put in. Now you've got to do a little bit of jiggery pokery in the back of this car because it's incredibly thin plastic down here. There's just no real strength to it. So I don't know if you can see, I've opened up these holes in the back. I took away this exhaust moulding and opened up the holes behind it so that you can get the pod mounts through, and then I glued on an extra piece of plastic card across the bottom to create this shelf where you can actually fit the mounting lugs onto. And as I try and see now, there's a little tiny reinforcing piece in there as well to reinforce it as well. So also there are some reinforcing bars down here. Let me just see if I can get a screwdriver. Down here there are 2 reinforcing bars. They're actually made out of G10 fiberglass, and they run all the way down to the back to strengthen up around this area here. There's just no strength in there by the time you've chopped away all this extra plastic to get the pod in. But that's how I did it. A piece of extra in here, cut out those holes, brought the mounting lugs through, glued in these extra reinforcers that run down either side. That got my pod in. Obviously then with a pod you need different axles, because as I understand it, the Ninco axles are 2.5mm and the standard is 2.38. So this is obviously a 2.38 pod because it's a standard slotted pod, so different axles, which necessitated different wheels, obviously. So these are actually, what ones are they? As I recall, they are Staffs 15 by 8, 15.8 by 10s on the rear, and 15.8 by 8.5s on the front. So that got me my wheels. But these look like the Ninco wheels. Well, they do, because these are the original Ninco wheels. I put the original wheels into my lathe and I turned off all the excess wheel and used the original wheel as the insert for the standard Staffs alloy wheel. These are just the basic ones. I don't know if you can see, they're just the basic wheels. So, and it worked out really rather well. The original Ninco wheels were, well, they were like eggs, basically. They were about as round as a banana. So that wasn't working either. That was really holding back the hop, or creating the hop, in fact, because this car hopped quite badly. And I would say probably 80% of the problem was actually the wheels, shaped like bananas. So, Staffs wheels, original wheels inserts put in, motor pod, different axles, standard axles, front and rear, and also a new pinion gear. So this is a slotted 28, 0 offset with a 9-tooth pinion. Now the front end is still got the original bearings because they work, quite simply. So in phase 2, I didn't actually chop off the shock absorbers. That was for the next phase. But for phase 3 I didn't. Phase 3 I put the shock absorbers on, I chopped them off. Phase 2 they were still on. So I just literally put the different axle through, the 2.38 axle, and they work great in the 2.5mm bearings, not a problem at all. So then I ran it like that and played around with some lead weight just to see if I could get it better. And it was a lot better, but still not really good enough. So on to phase 3. So phase 3. I was still getting problems with conductivity on the front guide. It was just kind of leaving the slot somehow and stopping power. Turns out that this front axle was too low and the guide was too high, and when it got to certain positions it would not allow the braid to touch the rail. So I took the front axle out, I chopped off the front shock mounts completely, I put a shim underneath the guide. This is an NSR guide, so that's for stage 4, Imagine it's with the original guide. Put the guide in with a shim, set the body on to the chassis and put the whole thing into a setup plate, and shimmed my guide to the right height that I was comfortable with for ground clearance on the front and so on, and then put some car body filler inside the bottom of the bearing holders. Because they were oval to allow the suspension on the original setup, there was a gap. So I put car body filler in the bottom, set the front axle back in with a little bit of paper underneath each wheel just to give me a little bit of extra clearance, a little bit of wiggle room. Let the car body filler harden off and then put super glue over the top. That locked in my bearings, set to my guide height. Then I also made on the lathe two very small shims. I think they're 60 thousandths of an inch wide. I think they're exactly 60 thou, to give me a little bit of side play, not too much. It looks more in the camera, but it really isn't very much in real life. And that set up my front end. And as you can see now, it runs pretty damn smooth. Not too bad at all. And that got me my front end a lot better. I was getting conductivity and I was able to shim the front guides to where I wanted it to be, and that got it nice. And then the rest of stage 3 was dealing with this carnage. I really didn't want to play with the interior too much because it is a very nice interior to this car, but needs must. So my compromise was to chop off the original back end of the interior and marry it to a Lexan interior, half and half. Now, I've chopped this one down for a future project, but this you'll see later on. And that's how it was. So then I got the best of both worlds. I got my lovely clearance that I've been struggling with the motor, along with all the looks, with all of the original parts all in it, and it looked fantastic. It barely looked like I'd done anything to it. Yet all of my problems with getting the clearance needed when you put in a larger motor, you get the problem here where you have to cut away the interior and you have to Dremel to death these poor guys in there. Dremeled and dremeled and dremeled their arms away, desperately trying to keep the detail, but you can see the difference in height is just all his arm up here on both of them, and I was struggling all the time. It was, in all honesty, rubbing all of the time. You can see the, actually I can show you with the original motor. Here we are. So the original motor used to sit in there and it was painted black, and you could see, and I was always struggling for clearance. You can see how tight it is. So with the what I call the hybrid interior, which the idea was given to me by a guy on the slot forum, to be honest, I got all my clearance, and I literally ended up going from struggling for every ounce of grip to a good 2 millimeters of clearance, and that made a world of difference. So that was the end of phase 3. Now phase 4, we come back to the motor pod. This is actually a 0.5 millimeter, 0.5 millimeter offset slotted motor pod. The original motor pod I started with was a standard 0 offset motor pod, but I bought this half offset for another project. It wasn't going to fit in it. It was a little bit too much, but I thought, I know, I'll stick it in this because this loves it. This will take the 0.5 mil, no problem. So I swapped out the 0 offset for a 0.5 mil offset into this chassis, and then made one of the biggest changes, or one of the biggest performance changes that I could have done, and that is to swap this rather nice but a little bit cammy, in my opinion, motor from the, well, I won't say the shop, but it's a little bit cammy. I find it just comes in a little bit peaky, or it might have just been my imagination, but I just felt it was a little bit peaky. So driving my NSR 997, trying to work out why it was so smooth, along with other things why. But one of the things, I was convinced that the motor was the key. So I splashed the cash and I got this NSR motor. Tried it, and yeah, beautiful, absolutely fantastic. really smooth progressive power. So 1/2 mil offset motor pod, NSR motor. Now we're really talking. Then I turned my attention back to the body, and I didn't want to do this because the interior was so nice. Even my revised interior was awesome, but needs must. So out with all the glass. Here's all the old bits of glass. It all got chopped out or pulled out and discarded, sadly. All that gone. And a Lexan glass set, homemade Lexan glass set in there. Put the B pillars back in with a bit of sticky white plastic. Got some stickers from an old radio controlled car kit that I had from literally the 80s. And a Savox sticker because it looked okay in the back window and didn't have any other stickers. So that got me the glass done. And a full lightweight interior. And yes, it isn't supposed to have a spare wheel in the back, but what you're going to do, I couldn't find one with an engine in it. I had to have a rally interior. So here we are. I mean, it's fine. I tend not to look too hard, and it's, it is what it is. The other thing that I did was I dremeled out all of the plastic on the inside of the body, as much as I could get out of there, because I was convinced that the car was still a little bit top heavy. It seemed to have quite a top heavy characteristic. When it was in the extremes of the corners, especially the flowing ones, it would grip up and then just suddenly seem to roll over. It wasn't bad, but it was there, and I had to find a reason why. And go swapping back and forth between my NSR 997 and this car. They were both very similar in performance at this point, but this one just seemed to get to a point and just flip, and I just felt that it was probably a bit too top heavy. So I weighed the body, the original standard body, and it was 24 grams. All of the components stripped out, it was 16 grams. So just a bare white, the bare plastic, no interior, no glass, 16 grams. I then dremeled out all this plastic, which dropped it down to about 12 grams, and then put in my lightweight glass and full lightweight interior. And now it's at about 15 grams. So that's down from 24 grams to about 15 grams, and that made a huge difference. Now this car runs very similar to my NSR 997. Very predictable, very stable, super quick and super smooth. The only trouble now is it's so good, I tend to overdrive it. You have to drive this car as if you feel like you're going too slow, because if you drive it as fast as you feel that it should be driven, you're massively overdriving it and you get yourself into problems. So I underdrive it just slightly, and I suddenly find that the time is way faster than I thought that it was, and it really didn't feel like it. So there we are. That's how I turned my Ninco 037 into a car that I can really drive. I got a lot to learn with it, and a lot of the tips that I've been showing you today didn't come from me and my imagination, came from the fantastic guys in my club, and a lot of help from the slot forum as well. So between my club and slot forum and a bit of my own ideas, I've managed to get a car that I really like. I got a lot to learn with it, and it needs some time, but there it is. It works. So I hope that's helped somebody. Hope that somebody can get something out of what I've done, if not all of it, part of it, or maybe none of it, who knows. But and I know the fast guys are going to be there rolling their eyes saying, yeah, we know all this, Rob, you've not broken any new ground. And I'm not suggesting that I have, but these are just some of the tips that I've done, showing you some of the tips that I've done with my car to help me personally get this thing around the track in the way that I want it to. So hopefully that's been of use to somebody. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Thank you very much indeed. Until the next one, have a good one.
Test.
Hello, I'm here watching the cat on the floor while staring into the camera, thinking to myself, can I not look at the cat because he's so cute?